The alien scout ship streaked across Earth's atmosphere like a dying star, flames licking at its metallic skin as it spiraled out of control. Inside, Zira gritted her sharp teeth, trying to override the ship's failing systems, but it was useless. The engines were dead, navigation fried. She was going down. Hard. With a deafening roar, the craft slammed into the dense forest, carving a smoking scar into the earth before finally skidding to a halt. The sudden silence afterward was deafening. For a long moment, Zyra lay motionless, the glowing circuits of her suit flickering weakly. Her head throbbed, but she was alive. She couldn't say the same for the rest of her crew. She felt their life signals fade into nothingness, one by one. Alone now, on this primitive backwater planet, Zyra forced herself to stand. She staggered out of the wreckage, her sharp eyes scanning the alien landscape. The forest was thick, the air heavy with moisture and unfamiliar scents. She'd studied Earth from orbit, watched their broadcasts, analyzed their technology. Humans were primitive creatures, barely scratching the surface of space travel. Their weapons were toys compared to the energy cannons Zyra was trained with. This should be easy. But something felt off. Zyra moved swiftly through the trees, her slim figure blending into the shadows. She needed to find shelter and signal for a rescue. But as she crept deeper into the forest, she heard something strange. A rhythmic pounding, distant but growing louder. Curious, she followed the sound until the trees opened up into a clearing. Her breath caught in her throat. In the middle of the clearing stood a human military base, hastily constructed but heavily guarded. Soldiers in bulky uniforms marched in perfect formation, their faces grim. Zyra crouched low, her bioluminescent skin dimming as she observed from the shadows. She had expected crude spears and basic explosives, maybe even rudimentary firearms. But what she saw chilled her to the core. The humans were testing their weapons on massive metal slabs, thick, reinforced steel, the kind that could withstand plasma blasts from orbit. Zyra smirked at first, watching a soldier raise a small, clunky rifle. "Let's see how far your toys get you," she thought. The shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed through the trees. Zyra's smirk vanished as the bullet tore through the steel like it was paper, leaving a gaping, smoking hole. Her eyes widened in disbelief. No, that's impossible. She had seen primitive species before, but none with weapons that could do this kind of damage. Another soldier stepped forward, carrying a larger weapon, something even more terrifying. It fired, and the blast ripped an entire slab in half, sending shards flying like deadly shrapnel. Zyra felt a shiver run down her spine, something she hadn't felt in years. Fear. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her mind racing. How could these creatures, with their crude technology, have weapons powerful enough to damage reinforced steel? If their primitive firearms could do this, what else were they hiding? Zyra's mission had just become far more dangerous than she ever anticipated. Suddenly, one of the soldiers turned, scanning the tree line with sharp eyes. Zyra froze, barely daring to breathe. The soldier's gaze lingered on her hiding spot for a moment too long before moving on. Zyra's heart pounded in her chest. She needed to get out of there. Now. But as she backed away, her foot snapped a twig beneath the undergrowth. The soldier's head snapped back toward her direction. Alarms blared. Voices shouted. Flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the forest floor. Zyra turned and ran, her heart pounding in time with the shouts behind her. But no matter how fast she moved, she couldn't shake the terrifying thought echoing in her mind. These humans aren't as primitive as we thought. Zyra sprinted through the dense forest, her slender frame weaving effortlessly between the towering trees. Her heart raced, not from exertion, but from something far more alarming. Fear. The humans were chasing her, their heavy boots thudding against the ground, their strange weapons clutched tightly in their hands. She had faced dangerous creatures before, battled alien beasts on hostile worlds, but nothing had prepared her for this. The weapons they carried weren't supposed to be this powerful. They were primitive creatures, using outdated technology compared to her advanced civilization. Yet the way their bullets shredded through steel had left her rattled. If their crude firearms could do that, what could they do to her? A sharp, burning pain shot through her side as a bullet grazed her skin. Zira hissed, stumbling behind a thick tree trunk for cover. She pressed her hand against the wound, expecting it to be superficial. But when she pulled her hand away, the sight made her blood run cold. Her usually resilient, iridescent skin was scorched, the wound deep and raw. She had never felt anything like this before. Not from plasma blasts. Not from energy swords. What kind of weapons are these? Before she could move, a bright light swept over her hiding spot. Shouts erupted, and before Zira could react, something heavy and metallic slammed into the back of her head. The world spun, and everything went dark. When Zira awoke, the cold sting of metal pressed against her wrists and ankles. She was in a dimly lit room, the walls made of thick concrete, the air heavy with the smell of oil and sweat. Her hands were shackled behind her back with primitive iron cuffs, but somehow they held firm against her attempts to break free. Her strength, usually enough to snap through steel, was useless here. The humans had planned for this. Across the room, several soldiers stood guard, their weapons trained on her as if expecting her to explode at any moment. Their eyes were wary, but there was something else there too, curiosity. They were studying her, trying to understand what she was. Zira glared at them, her sharp blue eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, but it only seemed to make them more cautious. The door creaked open, and a man in a decorated uniform stepped inside. His face was weathered, with sharp eyes that spoke of experience and suspicion. He approached Zira slowly, his boots echoing off the concrete floor. "Well, well," he muttered, crouching down to meet her gaze. "You're not from around here, are you?" Zira didn't respond. She didn't know if they could even understand her language, and she wasn't about to give them any more information than necessary. But the man seemed to expect her silence. He chuckled, standing back up. "You're tougher than you look. Took 6 of my best men to bring you in," he said, motioning to the soldiers behind him. "But even tough things break eventually." He nodded to one of the soldiers, who stepped forward with a strange device in hand. It wasn't a weapon, at least not one Zira recognized. But when the soldier pressed it against her arm, a jolt of electricity surged through her body, making her convulse in pain. She bit down hard, refusing to scream, but the burning sensation was unlike anything she'd ever felt. Their technology may have been crude, but it was effective. As the device was pulled away, the man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're going to tell us everything. Where you came from, what you're doing here, and how many more of you are out there." Zira met his gaze, her jaw clenched. She wouldn't break. She couldn't. But deep down, a new fear gnawed at her. These humans weren't just dangerous. They were relentless. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time blurred together in the cold, dark cell. Zira's wounds ached, her energy drained from the constant prodding and interrogation. But something else was gnawing at her mind. The more she observed the humans, the more she realized how unpredictable they were. They weren't following any logic she understood. They were chaotic, emotional, driven by something deeper than just survival. One night, as she lay in the corner of her cell, Zira overheard a conversation between 2 guards. They spoke in hushed tones, but she could still make out their words. "They're transferring her tomorrow," one whispered. "To that secret lab up north." "Yeah, I heard about that place," the other replied. "They're going to tear her apart, figure out what makes her tick." Zira's heart pounded. She couldn't let that happen. She had to escape. But with her strength waning and their weapons capable of hurting her in ways she never imagined, the odds were stacked against her. As the guards left, Zira stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. The humans were more than just a primitive species. They were dangerous in ways she couldn't yet comprehend, and that terrified her more than anything. The dim light flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cold concrete walls of Zara's cell. Her body ached from the burns and bruises inflicted by the humans' crude but effective weapons. Every breath was a reminder of her failure. She had underestimated them, and now she was paying the price. But Zara wasn't one to give up easily. She had faced death before, on distant worlds far more hostile than this one. If there was even a slim chance of escape, she would take it. For hours, she lay still, conserving her energy, her sharp mind analyzing every detail of the cell. The walls were thick, reinforced concrete. The door was solid metal, with a small window covered by bars. The humans weren't taking any chances, but Zara wasn't planning to brute force her way out. She had other skills these primitive creatures couldn't even comprehend. She closed her eyes, focusing on the faint hum of energy in the air. Even in this primitive facility, there were electronic systems, security cameras, lights, and communication devices. Zara's species had evolved to interact with technology on a molecular level. With enough concentration, she could manipulate these systems, even if they were crude by her standards. Her fingers twitched as she extended her consciousness into the wires hidden behind the walls. She could feel the electricity pulsing through them, chaotic and unrefined, but it was enough. Slowly, she began to overload the circuits, one by one. The lights flickered more violently now, and outside her cell, she heard confused voices. "What's going on with the power?" One guard muttered. "Probably just a glitch. This place is falling apart," another replied. Zara smirked. "Let them think it's a glitch." Moments later, the entire facility was plunged into darkness. Alarms began to blare, but the confusion was exactly what Zara needed. She focused on the lock mechanism of her cell door, sending a surge of energy through the system. Sparks flew as the electronic lock short-circuited, and with a loud clunk, the door swung open. She moved quickly, her steps silent against the concrete floor. The guards were distracted, their attention on the malfunctioning systems. But Zara knew it was only a matter of time before they realized she was missing. As she navigated the dark corridors, she stumbled upon a control room filled with monitors displaying various parts of the facility. Her eyes scanned the screens, looking for the quickest escape route, but what she saw made her freeze. One of the monitors showed a hidden laboratory deep within the base. Inside, humans in white lab coats were studying pieces of alien technology. Her technology. Weapons, communication devices, even biological samples from her fallen crew. The sight filled Zara with a mixture of anger and fear. The humans were reverse engineering her civilization's advanced tech, and if they succeeded, there was no telling what kind of havoc they could unleash. She had to stop them. But before she could act, a noise behind her made her spin around, ready to fight. Instead of a guard, she found herself staring into the eyes of a young soldier. He wasn't much older than she appeared to be, with short brown hair and sharp green eyes that gleamed even in the dim light. He held a rifle, but it wasn't aimed at her. For a tense moment, neither of them moved. Zara's muscles tensed, ready to strike if he made the slightest threatening move. But instead, the soldier did something unexpected. He lowered his weapon. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "If you want to get out of here, you'll need my help." Zara narrowed her eyes, not trusting him for a second. Why would a human help me? She didn't say a word, but her body language made her suspicion clear. The soldier seemed to understand. "Look, I don't have time to explain, but not everyone here agrees with what they're doing to you. My name's Jake. I can get you out, but you need to trust me." Zara's mind raced. This could be a trap, a trick to lure her into another cell, or worse. But she didn't have many options. The humans' weapons had already proven they could hurt her, and navigating this base alone would be risky. Finally, she gave a small, reluctant nod. Jake sighed in relief, motioning for her to follow. They moved through the dark corridors together, Jake leading the way with practiced ease. As they passed through different sections of the base, Zara noticed how familiar he seemed with the layout. He wasn't just a low-level soldier. He knew more than he let on. They eventually reached a maintenance tunnel, hidden behind a heavy steel door. Jake pried it open, letting Zara slip inside first. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, a stark contrast to the high-tech facilities Zara was used to. But it was their best shot at avoiding the guards. As they crawled through the tunnel, Zara finally broke her silence. "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was soft, melodic, but laced with suspicion. Jake hesitated before answering. "Because I've seen what they're doing in that lab. They're not just studying your tech, they're planning to use it. On people. On other countries. You're not the only one in danger." Zara's heart pounded. The humans weren't just curious, they were preparing for war. And with alien technology in their hands, they could become a threat not just to their own planet, but to the entire galaxy. When they finally emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air, Zara took a deep breath, the scent of the forest grounding her. But her relief was short-lived. She knew escaping the facility was just the beginning. The humans were far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now, they had her technology. The night air felt colder than Zara had anticipated, biting against her skin as she stepped out of the maintenance tunnel. The dense forest loomed ahead, its shadows stretching long and dark beneath the pale moonlight. Every rustling leaf, every distant chirp of an insect felt amplified in the stillness. Zara had escaped the facility, but the weight in her chest told her the real danger was far from over. Jake emerged from the tunnel behind her, his breath visible in the crisp air. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the tension between them thick and unspoken. Zara glanced at him, her glowing blue eyes narrowing slightly. She still didn't trust him. Why would a human risk everything to help an alien escape? His reasons felt thin, his words rehearsed. But for now, she needed him. She couldn't navigate this planet alone, not with the humans' unpredictable nature and their terrifying weapons. "We need to move," Jake whispered, breaking the silence. His eyes darted back toward the facility, where searchlights began sweeping the forest, cutting through the darkness like blades. "They'll realize you're gone soon." Zara nodded, though her mind raced with questions. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot. Jake led the way with surprising confidence, his steps sure and deliberate, as if he knew exactly where they were going. After what felt like hours of weaving through dense underbrush and climbing over fallen trees, they finally reached a small clearing. In the center sat an old, beat-up truck, partially hidden beneath a camouflage tarp. Jake pulled it off quickly, revealing the vehicle beneath. "This'll get us far enough from here," he said, opening the driver's side door and motioning for Zara to get in. She hesitated, eyeing the truck suspiciously. It was another primitive machine, loud and inefficient compared to the silent hovercrafts she was used to. But she didn't have the luxury of choice. Reluctantly, she slid into the passenger seat, her eyes never leaving Jake as he started the engine. The truck roared to life, the sound jarring in the otherwise quiet night. As they drove, the forest gave way to open fields, and the stars above seemed to stretch endlessly across the sky. Zara found herself staring at them, feeling a pang of homesickness. She was light years from her world, surrounded by beings who viewed her as a threat, or worse, a tool to be exploited. After a long stretch of silence, Jake finally spoke. "There's something you need to see." Zara's gaze snapped back to him, her suspicion flaring. "What do you mean?" Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. "You saw the lab, right? The tech they're working on." He glanced at her, his green eyes reflecting a seriousness that made Zara uneasy. "That's just the tip of the iceberg." Zara's pulse quickened. She had seen enough in that lab to know humans were meddling with forces they didn't understand. But Jake's tone suggested something even worse. They drove in tense silence for another hour before Jake pulled off the road onto a narrow dirt path. The truck bumped and jolted as they made their way deeper into the woods until they finally came to a stop near an old, abandoned warehouse. Jake cut the engine and turned to Zira. "This is where they're hiding the real stuff." Zira's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The military lab was just for show. The real experiments, the dangerous ones, they're happening here. Off the books. No one in the government even knows about it. But I've seen it." Zira's heart pounded in her chest. What could be more dangerous than what I've already seen? She followed Jake out of the truck, her senses on high alert. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior blending into the shadows. They approached cautiously, Jake leading her to a side entrance hidden behind a stack of old crates. The ride back from the hidden warehouse was suffocatingly silent. Zira sat rigid in the truck's passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, but her mind consumed with what she'd just witnessed. The humans weren't just playing with alien technology. They were weaponizing it at an alarming rate. The hybrid devices she'd seen weren't crude experiments anymore. They were dangerous prototypes, the kind of tools that could bring entire civilizations to their knees if perfected. And the worst part, they weren't far from doing just that. Zira stole a glance at Jake, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than before, his jaw clenched. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard lights, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, maybe, or fear. She couldn't tell which, but it gnawed at her. She had trusted him, at least enough to escape the facility. But now she wasn't so sure. His knowledge of the secret lab, his access to classified military routes, his ease in navigating the shadows, it all felt too convenient. Why would a simple soldier know so much? The truck rumbled down an old dirt path, far from any signs of civilization. The forest on either side grew denser, the trees leaning in as if to eavesdrop on their unspoken tension. Zira's fingers itched to reach for a weapon, any weapon, but she had none. She was vulnerable, something she hadn't felt in years. Finally, unable to contain her suspicion, she broke the silence. "Why are you really helping me?" Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled the truck over to the side of the road, killing the engine. The sudden silence felt deafening in the cool night air. He stared ahead, his eyes distant, as if he were trying to gather the right words. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "I wasn't supposed to." Zira's eyes narrowed, her body tensing. "What does that mean?" Jake sighed, rubbing his face with both hands before turning to meet her gaze. "I was part of the team assigned to capture you. From the moment your ship crashed, they had us tracking your every move. I wasn't just some random soldier. I was embedded in the unit that studied alien tech." Zira's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral, masking the surge of betrayal rising within her. "So, what? You're here to deliver me back to them." Jake shook his head quickly, his face contorting with something that looked like regret. "No, that's not it. At first, yeah, I was just following orders. I didn't know what they were really doing. But when I saw what was happening in that lab, when I saw how far they were willing to go, I couldn't be part of it anymore." Zira's mind raced, analyzing every word, every subtle shift in his tone. Could she believe him? Or was this just another layer of deception? She had seen enough betrayal in her life to recognize the signs, but Jake's fear felt real. And so did his guilt. "Why should I trust you?" she asked coldly, her glowing eyes narrowing into slits. Jake hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. Zira tensed, ready to strike, but he didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he retrieved a small, worn photo and handed it to her. Zira took it cautiously, her eyes scanning the image. It was a picture of Jake, much younger, standing next to a woman and a little girl with bright green eyes, the same shade as his. They were smiling, the kind of genuine, unguarded happiness Zaira hadn't seen in years. "That's my sister and my niece," Jake said quietly. "They live not far from here. When I saw what the military was planning to do with your tech, I realized it wasn't just about aliens or enemies. They'd use those weapons on anyone who got in their way, even innocent people, even my family." Zira stared at the photo, her mind warring with itself. Trust didn't come easy, especially not now. But there was something in Jake's voice, a raw honesty that was hard to fake. And if what he said was true, the danger was even greater than she had imagined. Before she could respond, a sudden explosion rocked the ground beneath them, the shockwave rattling the truck's windows. Both of them instinctively ducked, their heads snapping toward the direction of the blast. In the distance, a column of smoke rose into the sky, illuminated by the glow of fire. Jake's eyes widened in horror. That's near the safe house." Without another word, he started the truck again, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped toward the source of the explosion. Zaira's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. Had the military found them? Had someone betrayed them? As they neared the burning wreckage, Zaira could see what was left of a small cabin, its walls reduced to charred splinters. But what caught her attention wasn't the destruction. It was the figure standing amidst the flames, holding a sleek, alien-looking weapon. It was General Hayes, the man who had interrogated her back at the facility. His face was twisted into a cruel smile, his eyes glinting with sadistic pleasure. He spotted Jake and Zira in the truck, raising the weapon and aiming directly at them. Jake swerved the truck violently, the shot missing them by inches and tearing through a tree instead. They skidded to a stop behind a thick cluster of trees, the air filled with the acrid scent of burning wood and melted metal. Zira turned to Jake, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "You said no one knew about this place." Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. I didn't tell anyone, I swear." But Zira wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was racing, connecting the dots. General Hayes had known exactly where to find them. The only explanation was betrayal. But if Jake hadn't betrayed her, who had? As they crouched behind the truck, trying to catch their breath, Zaira's sharp ears picked up something else, a faint beeping sound, growing louder and more insistent. Her eyes snapped to the dashboard, where a small blinking device was attached beneath the steering column. A tracker. Zaira's blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They had been followed the entire time. But how? She hadn't seen anyone plant it. And Jake, if he truly hadn't betrayed her, then someone else had set this in motion long before they even left the facility. Before she could say anything, General Hayes's voice echoed through the trees, amplified by some kind of communication device. "You can't run forever, alien. We've got your tech. And soon, we'll have you too. Surrender now, and maybe I'll let your little friend live." Jake clenched his fists, his face twisted with anger. "We can't fight him head-on. His weapon's too powerful." Zira's mind raced, formulating a plan. She couldn't let the humans win. Not like this. She had to destroy the stolen tech before it was too late. But first, she had to get them out of this alive. She turned to Jake, her eyes burning with determination. "We're not surrendering." Jake stared at her, his face pale but resolute. "Then what do we do?" Zira's lips curled into a fierce smile, the first genuine one she'd had in days. "We fight fire with fire." As the flames from the destroyed cabin flickered in the distance, Zira knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. This was war. The forest was alive with danger, every shadow flickering with the promise of death. Zira crouched behind the battered truck, her mind racing as General Hayes's voice echoed through the trees. His words dripped with arrogance, but beneath the bravado, Zira sensed something more. A deep, calculated confidence. Hayes wasn't just relying on stolen alien tech. He knew he had the upper hand. But Zira wasn't about to let him win. She glanced at Jake, his face pale but determined. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the magazine of his rifle, the weight of their situation settling on him like a heavy cloak. Zira could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't a soldier anymore, not in the way Hayes was. Jake had crossed a line, betraying his orders to help her. Now there was no going back. "We can't stay here," Jake whispered, his voice low and urgent. "If Hayes has that weapon, he'll cut through this truck like it's paper." Zira nodded, her sharp mind already working through possibilities. She had no weapons, no armor, and her energy reserves were dangerously low after the escape. But she still had her knowledge and her ability to manipulate technology. The problem was, Hayes had more than just alien gadgets now. He had the element of surprise and an army of soldiers who would follow him to the ends of the earth. But Zira had faced worse odds. "We need to separate him from the weapon," she murmured, her eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "If I can get close enough, I can disable it." Jake shot her a skeptical look. "You're planning to walk up to him. He'll shoot you before you take 2 steps. Zara's lips curled into a faint smile. "Not if he's distracted." Before Jake could argue, Zira was already moving, slipping into the shadows with silent precision. Her body ached with every step, but she pushed the pain aside. Survival depended on speed and stealth now. As she weaved through the trees, she could hear Hayes barking orders to his soldiers, their boots crunching against the forest floor as they spread out in search of her. Zira's mind raced. She needed an edge, something the humans wouldn't expect. That's when she spotted it, a fallen drone, half buried in the undergrowth. It was one of the surveillance units the military had used to track her. The metal was dented, but its power core still glowed faintly. Perfect. She knelt beside it, her fingers moving quickly to extract the core. With a few deft adjustments, she rigged it into a makeshift energy pulse device. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to fry any nearby electronics, including Hayes' stolen weapon, if she could get close enough. Meanwhile, Jake moved into position on the opposite side of the clearing. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had made his choice. Now he had to see it through. Hayes' soldiers were everywhere, their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the darkness. But they weren't prepared for what happened next. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the forest as Jake fired his rifle, hitting one of the soldiers squarely in the chest. Chaos erupted instantly. The soldiers dove for cover, shouting orders and returning fire in Jake's direction. The distraction was exactly what Zira needed. She moved like a shadow, slipping through the chaos toward Hayes, who stood in the center of the clearing, his stolen alien weapon glowing ominously in his hands. His eyes flicked around, searching for Zira, but he didn't see her until it was too late. With a burst of speed, Zira lunged from the shadows, hurling the modified drone core directly at the weapon. It struck with a sharp crack, releasing a blinding surge of energy that arced through the air like lightning. The alien tech in Hayes' hand sputtered and died, the glow fading as the circuits fried. Hayes staggered back, his face twisting in rage. "You think that's enough to stop me?" he snarled, reaching for a sidearm. But Zira was already moving, her body a blur as she closed the distance between them. She slammed into him with all the force she could muster, knocking the gun from his hand. They hit the ground hard, rolling through the dirt in a tangle of limbs. Hayes was strong, stronger than Zira had anticipated. His fists landed heavy blows, but Zira was faster, her movements honed from years of combat training. She dodged his strikes, her eyes locked onto his with fierce determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about stopping him before he could unleash chaos on the galaxy. With a final powerful strike, Zira drove her knee into Hayes' chest, knocking the wind out of him. She pinned him down, her glowing eyes narrowing as she pressed a sharp piece of broken metal against his throat. "It's over," she hissed. But Hayes just laughed. A low, menacing sound. "You think you've won. You have no idea what's coming." Zira's grip tightened on the makeshift blade, but before she could respond, a sharp whistle pierced the air, a signal from Jake. Zira turned just in time to see the remaining soldiers regrouping, their weapons trained on her. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and Hayes was right. This wasn't over. Zira sprang to her feet, dragging Hayes up with her as a human shield. She backed toward Jake, her mind racing for an escape plan. The soldiers hesitated, unwilling to risk shooting their commanding officer. "Jake!" Zira shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. Jake didn't need further instruction. He lobbed a grenade, one of the modified alien explosives they'd found in the warehouse, into the group of soldiers. The explosion rocked the clearing, sending shockwaves through the ground and scattering the soldiers like ragdolls. In the chaos, Zira and Jake made their move, disappearing into the forest with Hayes still in tow. They ran until their lungs burned, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. Only then did they stop, collapsing against a fallen tree, their bodies battered but alive. Hayes lay unconscious at their feet, his face bruised and bloodied. Zira stared down at him, her mind spinning with questions. What had he meant by "you have no idea what's coming"? Jake groaned, clutching his side where a stray bullet had grazed him. "We can't keep running forever," he panted. "They'll find us again." Zira nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. "Then we don't run." Jake looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Zira's lips curled into a fierce smile. "We take the fight to them." The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but Zira was done hiding. If the humans wanted a war, they were about to find out exactly how dangerous an alien could be. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting to stop a threat that could consume not just Earth, but the entire galaxy. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an eerie orange glow over the smoldering forest. The air was thick with the scent of burned wood and scorched metal, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Zira stood at the edge of a ravaged clearing, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first light touched the destruction they had left behind. The battle was over, but its echoes still rang in her mind. The explosions, the screams, the crack of human weapons that had proven far more lethal than she ever imagined. At her feet, General Hayes lay motionless, his once proud face now battered and bloodied, a faint rise and fall of his chest, the only sign he was still alive. Zira had thought about ending him right there, putting a permanent stop to the man who had orchestrated so much chaos. But something inside her hesitated, not because of mercy, but because she knew Hayes was just a symptom of a far greater disease. Jake sat on a fallen log nearby, his face pale, one hand pressing against the bandage on his side where a bullet had grazed him during their escape. His rifle lay across his lap, but his grip on it was loose, his energy drained after the long night. He stared into the distance, his green eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of what they had just survived. Finally, Jake broke the stillness. "We did it," he whispered, as if saying it out loud might make it more real. "We stopped him." Zira's eyes didn't leave the horizon. Her voice was calm but cold. "We stopped him, but not them." Jake turned toward her, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "We destroyed the lab, took out Hayes. The tech's gone." Zira finally looked at him, her glowing blue eyes sharp and unyielding. "Do you really think he was the only one? Humans are adaptable. You learned how to harness alien technology in weeks. If one of you could figure it out, so can others." Jake's face paled further. The weight of her words sank in, and he realized the truth behind them. Hayes might have been the face of the operation, but the knowledge, the blueprints, the desire, those were out there now. And humans, once they tasted power, never let it go. So, what do we do now? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. Zara turned back to the horizon, her jaw tightening. The rising sun cast long shadows across the scared earth, and for the first time since she'd landed on this planet, Zara felt the enormity of what she was up against. "I need to leave," she said quietly. "Warn my people. Earth isn't just a primitive world anymore. It's a threat." Jake's heart sank. He'd known this moment was coming, but hearing it aloud felt like a punch to the gut. He'd spent the last few days fighting alongside Zara, seeing her not as an alien, but as an ally, maybe even a friend. But now, the lines were clear again. She was from a different world, a different species, and her mission wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting her kind from his. You think they'll come back?" Jake asked, his voice strained. Zara's expression darkened. "If humans keep pushing the way they are, they won't give us a choice." Jake stared at the ground, his mind reeling. He thought about his sister and niece, the innocent faces in the photo he'd shown Zara. He thought about the world he knew, the people who had no idea how close they were to annihilation. And for the first time, he wasn't sure who the real threat was. "You're not all like Hayes," Zara said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Her voice softened slightly. Some of you are different. But that doesn't matter if the wrong people are in control." Jake nodded slowly, the truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. He'd seen it firsthand. The hunger for power, the willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to get it. And now that they tasted alien technology, there was no going back. Zara moved toward the wreckage of the facility where her ship had crashed. The hull was battered, the once sleek design now marred by scars from the battle. But it was still intact enough to get her off the planet. She paused at the entrance, turning back to Jake one last time. "You could come with me," she offered quietly, surprising even herself. There was something about Jake, his defiance, his loyalty, his willingness to fight against his own kind for what was right, that made her believe he didn't belong in this broken system. Jake's eyes widened. The idea was tempting. To leave Earth behind, to see the stars, to start fresh somewhere far from the corruption and chaos. But as much as he wanted to, he knew he couldn't. His family was here. His fight wasn't over. "I can't," he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "But you're right. We're a threat. I hope we don't destroy ourselves before we realize it." Zara nodded, respecting his choice. Without another word, she disappeared into the ship. The engines hummed to life, a soft, melodic sound that felt out of place against the backdrop of destruction. Jake stepped back, shielding his eyes as the ship lifted off the ground, rising into the sky with a trail of light. He watched until it was just a speck against the morning sky. Then finally, it was gone. The forest was silent again, but Jake knew it was only temporary. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as he turned back toward the world he'd sworn to protect, he felt a new weight settle on his shoulders. Because now, he wasn't just fighting for Earth's future. He was fighting to make sure they didn't become the very monsters the galaxy feared. And somewhere, far beyond the stars, Zara was doing the same. But the real question wasn't whether humanity would survive. It was whether they deserved to.